In today's video, I am going to teach you how to display text in the pivot table. To begin, make sure you already have an active pivot table on your worksheet. This method works when the pivot table is set up, and you can see the pivot table grid where your results appear. Now, the first thing you want to do is select the pivot table itself. Click any single data cell inside your active pivot table area. When you click a cell, you should notice that the pivot table becomes highlighted, and the pivot table tools or options related to pivot tables usually become available. This step matters because pivot table settings are applied to the pivot table you are currently working on, so you want to be sure you have the correct table selected before you change anything. Once you have clicked inside the pivot table, take a moment to look at the screen layout. On the right side of your Excel window, you should see a panel called Pivot Table Fields. This pane lists all the fields from your source data. It typically shows sections for rows, columns, values, and sometimes filters. If you do not immediately see it, you may need to adjust your window or click within the pivot table again. But for this tutorial, assume the Pivot Table Fields pane is visible. Now you are ready for the core changes that will display the text. Next, focus on the Pivot Table Fields pane. Find the text column field name in the list of fields. It will represent the column in your source data that contains the text values you want to display in the pivot table results. Once you locate that text field name, drag it into the Rows area box. When you drag the field into rows, you are telling Excel to treat those text entries as the row labels. After you drop it into the Rows area, you should see the pivot table update, and the table should begin listing your text values along the rows. This is the place where the text becomes visible, because rows are designed to show categories and labels. Now that the text field is in the rows area, you may notice that the pivot table is not yet showing values in the way you expect. That is normal, because at this stage, you have only told Excel how to arrange the text. The next step is to make sure the same text column field is also used in the values area. This is what helps pivot tables display the text information as part of the output. To do this, go back to the Pivot Table Fields pane and find the same text column field name again. Drag that same text field into the Values area box. As soon as you release the field into Values, Excel will recalculate the pivot table and place results into the Values area. Depending on your exact pivot table configuration and the text field type, Excel might show a count, a summary, or another default behavior. The main goal of this step is to ensure the text field is included in the Values area so the pivot table can display text-related results in the table. Watch the pivot table grid to confirm that the Values area is now populated and that the text information is reflected where you want to see it. After the pivot table updates, take a brief moment to review the layout. Your rows should now display the text entries you dragged into rows, and the Values area should now reflect the inclusion of that same text field in Values. If anything looks off, the first thing to check is that you used the correct field name and that it was placed into both the rows area and the values area. Placement in the correct areas is what controls how the pivot table interprets and displays the data. And that covers everything you need to know. And that is all there is to it.